Well, good evening. It is certainly good once again to be with you here tonight. It seems very strange to me that it is already Wednesday evening, and we have just seemingly breezed right through these last few days, but I have enjoyed them thoroughly, and of course I'll have more to say to that effect before our time expires this evening. Our lesson tonight, we want to focus on control, the idea of control. As you think about life in general, there are a lot of things that are out of our control. And most of us like to be in control. We like to feel in control of our lives, the things that we have going on. We like to be in control of our money, our possessions. We like to think that we're in control of our destinies and the things that are related to our families and friends. But let's just stop and think here as we begin about a few things that are indeed out of our control. Think about growing and how tall you are. It might seem like a elementary type of an example, but in Matthew chapter 6 verse 27 it says, "Which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature?" And I can think about when I was younger and I would wish I was taller. But we can stand around and wish we're taller all day long, and it's not going to have any effect on how tall we really are, is it? It's out of our control. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 36, here Jesus says, "Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black." Now, of course, men have invented artificial ways to alter the color of one's hair. But as we think about natural hair color, it's something that's out of our control, isn't it? As we get older, the gray hairs start to appear. It was observed, I forget who it was now, just the other day, somebody was looking at my hair and said, "You got some gray hairs in there." We can't control it. It's out of our ability to wrangle. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11, there the Hebrew, or the Ecclesiastes writer says, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race, notice, is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all." You know, as we seek to control the outcomes of different things in our lives, we prepare ourselves, we maybe train ourselves. We think about some kind of a sporting event perhaps, and we want to win the prize. And so we train hard and we discipline our bodies. But in the end, as he says here, time and chance happen to them all. Just because we're the best player on the team doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be as successful as one might think. So we think about the longevity of life. James chapter 4 verse 13, we noticed this passage earlier in the week. James says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spending a year there, buying and selling, making a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away." And it's funny, as we look at medical science and different things of that nature, men are always trying to invent new ways to live longer and be around on this earth for more years than the previous generations. But the simple fact remains that eventually we are going to return to the dust. And many times our lives come to an end. We hear about people who die very unexpectedly. People who were perfectly healthy, had everything going for them, and a car accident occurs or something of that nature, and we see just how fragile life is. And so yet another example of something that is really out of our control. And of course, to bring home to our theme here this week, Matthew chapter 24 verse 36, Jesus made the statement there of that day and hour, speaking of His return. He says, "No one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." And so as we think about when Jesus is coming, we know He's coming, we know He's coming soon, but we really don't know when that's going to be specifically, do we? And you think about Even in very recent history, there have been individuals who thought they figured it out. You remember that? And they gathered quite a following for themselves and got all kinds of money raised. I'm not really sure what the money was supposed to be for if the end of the world was coming. But then the day came and then it went by and the guy says, well, I miscalculated here. It's actually a couple months from now. And then, of course, that date comes and goes. And we just see time and time again that men cannot predict when the end of time will come. It is out of our control. But this evening, what I want us to focus on is the things that I can control, the things you can control. We could spend all kinds of time talking about what's out of our control, and it's good for us to recognize some of those things. But I think it's more important to recognize that there are some things that I have very real control over. And I believe that as we look at some scriptures here tonight, we will see just how important some of these things really are, especially as we think about our eternal destinies, where we will spend eternity. First point of our lesson, something I can control. I can control my enjoyment of God's physical gifts. As you think about people in the world today, there's a lot of very discontent people. And perhaps as we talk about that idea, maybe that characterizes you and I sometimes. We look at the things we have, maybe our house or our cars or just some of the possessions that we've attained, and we say, man, I'd really like to have more. If only I had this, or if only I had that. And so often we get so wrapped up in what we don't have, we forget what we do have. We forget what God has blessed us with. There in James 1 verse 17, we're told that every good and perfect gift comes down from God, the Father of lights. Do we recognize that? Come back here with me to the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Notice a few verses here in this book. First of all, chapter 2 and verse 24, we understand that God desires for us to recognize His gifts physically and to enjoy the things that He provides us. Solomon says that it's good for us to do this. Verse 24 there, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also, he says, I saw was from the very hand of God. Jump over there just a few pages to chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 15. Here again, Solomon says, I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. Come with me over here to the New Testament for a moment. Here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, we've made some reference to this chapter over the course of our lessons this week. But I want us to read here just a few verses, starting in verse 6. He says there, now godliness with contentment, notice that, is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And verse 8 is just so very humbling to consider. He says, having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you here this evening, as you think about your physical possessions, how many of you are limited to just the clothes on your back and something to eat? I don't think any of us are. Think about how far beyond that you are blessed. We have homes, we have automobiles to transport us wherever we need to go, we have TVs, all these different things just for entertainment. Now imagine that you just had food and clothing. Could you be content with that? God says that we can and should be. But as you think about it in those terms, it helps us to appreciate, doesn't it, just how much we've been given. And so let's recognize that we have control over our enjoyment of the things God provides us. Let's not take them for granted, but let's appreciate them. Let's give God thanks for them. Something else I can control. I can control my enjoyment of my marriage. And this is another thing as we look around the world today. A lot of people discontent. And, of course, I'm not sure what the statistics are anymore of the divorce rate and how many couples separate after marrying. But it's not good. People fail to realize, of course, and appreciate what marriage really is, the covenant that it is, not just between two people, but between them and God. But we get so focused on all these little details. Well, I don't like how she cooks. Well, he wears the same pants 5 days a week. He never trims his facial hair, and it's scratchy. You know, we let these little things pester us, and people divorce over such silly things. And they fail to appreciate what a blessing it is to find a spouse. The Scriptures tell us that it's a blessing from God when a man and a woman come together as husband and wife. Come back here again to the book of Ecclesiastes. Guess maybe I should have had you put a marker there. Ecclesiastes here in the 9th chapter and verse 9. Notice he says, "Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which He's given you under the sun, all the days of your vanity. For that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun." Come back here to Proverbs with me. In chapter 5, again we read the writings of King Solomon, of course as he was inspired by the Spirit of God. But here in chapter 5, beginning in verse 15, you know, one of the reasons we see so many divorces is because people are unfaithful to their spouses. That secretary at work starts to flirt with you and you think, well, the wife never pays me any attention, so I'm going to flirt back. And we have all these affairs going on. And it's to the point, because of our so-called entertainment that we see on TV and all these other media outlets, where that's just expected. That's normal. You know, soap operas today, if there's not an affair going on, well, that's a boring show. And so people just say, well, this is normal for me to go out and have a little something over here on the side. As long as nobody knows about it, it'll be fine. Notice what Solomon says. He says, "Drink water from your own cistern, and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your own, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love. Why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman, and be embraced in the arms of a seductress?" Over here a few pages to Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs 18 verse 22. He states there, "He who finds a wife," notice, "finds a good thing, and obtains favor from the Lord." Of course, we could continue to talk really just about this subject for the rest of our time tonight, but we will move on. But just briefly, you know, you go there to Ephesians chapter 5, and the latter part of the chapter there, where Paul starts to talk about husbands and wives. And of course, he makes the point, really what I'm talking about here is Christ and the church. You know, if couples getting married would sit down and read that, and understand that marriage is more than just a physical relationship between a man and a woman, but really it's a relationship that should reflect that of Christ and His church. And if they would follow those instructions that are given there in that passage, The husband loving his wife as himself, even willing to lay down his life for her. What do you think would happen to that divorce rate? We can control the enjoyment of our marriages. Let us recognize them for what they are, as a blessing, a gift from the Lord, and cherish them and nurture them. On the flip side of that coin, though, for those that are single, I would submit to you here this evening that you can control your enjoyment of being single. Come with me over here to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, of course, in the context of this particular chapter, we recognize that some of these instructions that Paul is laying down are due to, as he words it there, the present distress, and there were some things going on, persecution and things that affected his suggestions for these individuals. But nonetheless, I think there are some principles here that we can read and understand and make application of for those who are single even today, in seeing that while we might long to be married, while we are single, we can utilize that situation for the glory of God. And that's what I want us to see here. Notice with me, first of all, verses 7 and 8. Paul says, I wish that all men were even as I myself. Of course, Paul was unmarried. He says, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that. But I say to the unmarried, to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. And he really gets into the details of that and the reasoning behind that as you come down here to verse 32. And we'll start there down through verse 35. He says, I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord. Notice, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about things of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I say this for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord, he says, without distraction. And of course, those of us that are married, we understand that when we have a family, a wife, and kids, there's a lot of responsibilities that go hand in hand with that. And as I think about myself, and I'm sure Jason can relate to this as a preacher of the gospel, you know, it's a hard balance sometimes between devoting oneself to the work of the Lord and then making sure not to neglect one's family and the needs of the family. And so we can see how there's more responsibility on the person who is married and has a family than one who would be single. And so my admonition to you who are single here tonight, recognize that even though, again, you may be, I just really want to find the right one. And we go back to Genesis there in the beginning and we see where God recognizes it's not good that man should be alone. And we understand that God designed marriage. But while you're single, recognize the opportunity that you have to even more perfectly, or how do I want to word it, be able to utilize your time better in service to God. You have more opportunities to that end than you would perhaps if you were in a situation where you had a wife and children. So, something for us to consider. Recognize that we can control our enjoyment, whether we're single or married, as we kind of summarize these 2 points together. What else? I can control my determination to work hard. Again, let's come back here to the book of Ecclesiastes. And again in chapter 9 here. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, and this time we'll look at verse 10. He says there, whatever your hand finds to do, notice he says, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. I can recall my father saying many times as I grew up, whatever you end up doing for a living, you determine to do it to the best of your ability. Of course, it was something that he was told growing up. But he told me that growing up, his teacher told him, you know, if your job is to go out here and dig ditches along the highway, well, then you go out there and you do that to the very best of your ability. You be the best ditch digger that anyone's ever seen. And we need to make application of that principle, as we see here, to spiritual things. Our service to God. Are we really doing it to the best of our ability? Working as hard as we can? Or is it more just like a hobby that we do once in a while or on the weekends, and Sundays and Wednesdays roll around? Are we determined to work hard, to be committed to God? Come over here to the book of Colossians. Colossians, the 3rd chapter here, and verse 22 beginning. He says, "Bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh." And we could, of course, liken this relationship to employers and employees, if we want to put it in modern terminology. So, employees, obey in all things your employers according to the flesh. He says, "Not with eye service, as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. Whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." As we think about our jobs here on the earth, do we approach that work as if we are serving God Himself? Do we remember admonitions such as this that we've just read? Or is it one of those situations where when the boss is standing there, yeah, we're working away, we're typing on the computer, we're doing whatever we're supposed to be doing, but then the boss goes out the door and we pull up Minesweeper or Solitaire and kind of just chill out for the afternoon. Well, the boss is out, so I don't have anybody looking over my shoulder now. We forget that God's still looking. And there in Ecclesiastes 12, the first verse, of course, it tells us to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. And I would encourage those that are younger here tonight. And this is something that we've mentioned throughout the week and something we've been talking about in conversations one-on-one throughout the week. Just how quickly life flies by. You know, as you get older, you get to a certain age and you can't always do as much as you would like, as much as you used to be able to do. And so young people recognize that. And recognize that there are things maybe you can be doing now in service to God that as time goes on, maybe you won't be as able to do because of your physical limitations. And that's not to say that you older people can't be doing a lot. Don't get me wrong. But really my point is to show us that whatever age we are, we should be determined to do our very best. To be working as hard as we possibly can for the glory of God. We control that. Another thing I can control is the content of my thoughts. And that's a sobering thing to consider. Because I think all of us, if we're honest, we recognize there are times where our thoughts really aren't on things that we ought to be thinking about. And of course, we're surrounded by a world that tries to put thoughts into our head that we shouldn't be thinking about. But I'm in control of what's going on up here. Not any of you, not anybody else on the face of this earth. I control it. And you control your thoughts likewise. But what are we thinking about from moment to moment each day? Are we controlling our thoughts so as to be dwelling on things that are from God, things that will further build us up in our faith and allow us to be greater servants? You know, over here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 there, we're told what kind of things to think about. He says, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, Whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. You think about some of the things, some of the thoughts that go through your mind from day to day. Ask yourself, can I read through this list to describe what I'm thinking about, what I'm dwelling on and meditating on? Back here to Psalm 119. Psalm 119, verse 9, beginning. The writer here says, how can a young man cleanse his way? He says, by taking heed according to your word. He says, with my whole heart I have sought you. Let me not wander from your commandments. Your word, notice, I've hidden in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Blessed are you, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. With my lips I've declared all the judgments of your mouth. I've rejoiced in the way of your testimonies as much as in all riches. I will meditate on your precepts. I will contemplate your ways. I will delight myself in your statutes. I will not forget your word. This should describe our thoughts. But does it? We're reminded over here the words of Christ in Luke chapter 6. Jesus very plainly shows us that what we think about directly correlates to what we do, our actions, the things that we carry out from day to day. Here in verse 45, he says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. Notice, out of the abundance of the heart. And of course, when the Bible speaks of the heart, we're talking about the mind. Out of the abundance of the heart or the mind, the mouth speaks. And so the words that we speak, the actions we undertake, it all begins right here in our thoughts. And of course, Jesus talks about that in greater detail. You go back there to Matthew 5, and we won't take the time to do that here tonight. But we can control the content of our thoughts. Again, the question that we have to answer then is, are we controlling them? I can control my response to temptations. You know, you hear people say after they do something they shouldn't have done, well, the devil made me do it. That's been around for a long time now. But the reality is the devil doesn't make us do anything. Again, we control what we're doing and what we're saying. Now, he tries and influences us. He tries to, through various outlets and various schemes, influence our thoughts so as to influence then to follow through our actions. But he is not in control of you. And the sooner we recognize that, the better off we're going to be. I control my response to temptation. Come with me here to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We look here at verse 13 of the chapter. He says, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. We all face the same types of temptations, in other words. But notice, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. What is that telling us? It tells me that whatever temptation I'm facing, no matter how great it seems, sometimes we get into situations and we just feel like, how can I not give in to this? But this tells me that there is always a way of escape. Of course, what's the way of escape? It doesn't help us out too much if we don't understand what the way of escape is. Well, the way of escape is a knowledge of God's will and a determination to do it. When we face temptation and we have the thought, this is wrong, do we hone in on that? Do we grasp that and then do everything we can? You think about Joseph and how he was being tempted by his master's wife. What did he do? He found the way of escape, didn't he? She had his garment, but that didn't stop him. He ran out of the house. You know, sometimes we've got to run out of the house. As silly as it sounds. And maybe it's, you think about the computer. The computer seems like such a great source of our problems today. It's such a great tool, but at the same time, there's so much there that pulls us in the wrong direction. And you know, sometimes the solution is take the computer and throw it outside. You know, Jesus talked about cut off your hand, pluck out your eye. Don't let anything keep you from making it to the goal of heaven. We're in control here, but are we taking control as we face temptation? Ephesians 4 verse 27 there tells us not to give place to the devil. Come over here to James chapter 4. I believe this passage here highlights or establishes some of the things we've just mentioned as far as what is this way of escape. Here beginning in verse 7, we're told to submit to God, notice to resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You go to Matthew chapter 4 and you read the account there where Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, and Jesus resisted the devil each and every time, right? And what did he appeal to each and every time? He appealed to, it is written, God has said, the Word of God. He resisted the devil, and we're told at the end of that account that the devil left him. Now, of course, it was for a time. He returned, of course. But if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. But we have to draw near to God, you see, verse 8. And as we draw near to God, he draws near to us. We've got to cleanse our hands. We've got to purify our hearts. The way of escape is real and there. But we have to be determined. Again, we talked about that. Are we determined enough to find that way of escape? To take, I should say, that way of escape. And just quickly here, not to belabor the point, but one of the best things that you can do when you're tempted, and this is something I need to practice this more myself. I'm half the time preaching more to myself than I am to anybody else. The best thing I think we can do when we're tempted is to stop and pray to God. And be honest about what is going on. Say, God, I'm tempted. And we recognize there in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16, earlier in the week, about Jesus as our high priest, and we go through Him to have access to God, and we can come boldly to the throne of grace to find grace and help in times of need. Let's utilize that. We have so many tools that God has given us to be successful. Ephesians 6, the armor of God. It's all sourced from His Word. All these tools at our disposal, but yet we leave them on the shelf as we go out the door, morning after morning, and we don't utilize the strength of God. I can control my response to temptations. Am I? Are you? I can control my response to God's love. We're told there in Romans 3, verse 23, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. A very sobering thought, that we have all transgressed the laws of God. We have all broken His heart. Because as we've talked throughout the week, His purpose in creating us was so that we might reflect His purity and His glory and bring Him honor. But sin breaks us. Sin separates us. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. But the good news is that the gift of God, as the rest of that verse states, is eternal life through Jesus Christ. John 3:16. I'm sure that if we passed out a test tonight and said, write down what John 3:16 says, I'm pretty sure most all of us would be able to pass that test. It's one of the most quoted, if not the most quoted verse in all the Bible. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You know, we wonder sometimes, or maybe you've wondered, why did God design the church or instruct the church to observe the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? Doesn't that seem a little much? You know, we have different denominations today that only do it once a year or maybe a couple times a year. Well, doesn't that make it more special when we separate it out like that? But when you realize just how central the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is to each and every one of us, we recognize the logic of observing it every first day of the week. Keep it at the center of our attention, to keep us humble, to keep us headed in the right direction. Everything God designs and makes is logical. Sometimes we just fail to see the purpose in it. But do we recognize the love of God? It's up to us how we'll respond. Let's look here at a couple examples of how people have responded over the course of time. Come with me first of all to Acts chapter 17. Here in this particular chapter, Paul is at Athens and he's speaking to Gentiles who really have no concept of the true living God. Remember, they had the altar there with the inscription to the unknown God, and Paul uses that as an opportunity to declare unto them the one true God and the gospel message. But we see the reaction of those that he preached to as we look at verse 32. We find that when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, well, we'll hear you again on this matter. Paul departed from among them. Notice verse 34, some joined him and believed. Among them Dionysus, the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. We come back to Acts chapter 2. And of course, on this occasion we find a very favorable response, the response that we ought to have as we think about God's love and what He demands of us in response. Here again, we find the Gospels being preached on this occasion by the Apostle Peter. And in verse 37 there, when they heard the message, we're told they were cut to their hearts. They said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? And of course, Peter instructs them to repent, to let every one of you be baptized, he says, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. You know, the interesting thing about this account, and really the other accounts that we read throughout the book of Acts, where people are preached to, it is explained to them the gospel message, they didn't wait very long to respond, did they? You know, they heard the good news, they recognized their sin, and they responded. Right away. There was no, well, okay, I see what you're telling me there. I'll think about that. Give me a couple weeks. Of course, we think about Felix there in Acts 24. Maybe there's a few exceptions to that. But generally, it was an immediate, favorable response. What has our response been? Do we put it off? Do we think, well, I'll get to it later? Do we gamble thinking, well, I've got plenty of time left in my life. I don't think Jesus will be back this week. I've got time. And we're gambling when we do that. Gambling with our souls. Final point here for our lesson tonight And of course we'll tie this in a few moments with our invitation. But another thing that I can control is my course of action right now. Now I might not be able to say that in 15 minutes. I might not be able to say that tomorrow, because my life could come to an end, or Christ could come back. But right now, I'm in control of what I'm doing. And so what will we do as we think about what God expects of us, what God demands of us, what God desires of us, because He loves us so very much? Come here to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We look here at the first couple verses of this chapter. Paul says, "We then as workers together with him also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain, for he says, in an acceptable time I've heard you. In the day of salvation I've helped you. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." This moment, this day. We will pause here for just a moment as our young ones come into the auditorium, and we will offer the invitation once everyone has returned. Open up your songbooks there to number 322. That will be the song of invitation here in just a moment. We've spent some time here this evening considering some things that we have control over. Of course, as we began, we recognized that there are a lot of things that we can't control. Can't control how long we live. We can't control the color of our hair, how tall we are. We certainly can't control when Christ decides to return. There's a poem that maybe some of you have seen that reads, "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference." Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths." I would hope and pray here tonight that all of us recognize how frail and fragile life truly is. Don't think just because you're young that you're going to live forever. I'm already learning that. Dare I say I've learned it. Life flies by. It is truly but a vapor. And so we need to be determined, friends, to take control of what we are able to control. Control your thoughts. Control your actions. Respond in the appropriate way to the grace that has been shown by God through His Son. He loved you so very much. I mean, who do you know that would be willing to suffer in the way that Christ suffered for your life? You think about that. Who in your life do you know that would be willing to be abandoned by everyone, that could be called a friend, to be mocked, spat upon, to have a crown of thorns driven into their head, their scalp, to be beaten with rods, to be scourged so that their back was ripped open, to carry a cross up a hill, and ultimately be nailed to it and suspended between heaven and earth so that your life would be spared. When you contemplate what Christ has done, it really should bring tears to your eyes, because I don't deserve it. And we all recognize that we don't deserve the love that God has shown towards us. We can control our response to God's love. We can control our actions right now, tonight. You know, as we read here in Acts chapter 8, the account of Philip and the eunuch. Of course, the eunuch was going along the road there and he was studying the prophet Isaiah, and Philip joins himself to the chariot. There in verse 34, the eunuch asks Philip, "Of whom does the prophet say this, of himself or some other man?" And Philip opened his mouth, beginning at that scripture, preached Jesus to him. And as they went down the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" Philip said, "If you believe with all of your heart, you may." And he answered and said, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And so he commanded the chariot to stand still. Both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water. He baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord caught Philip away, so that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. If you're here this evening and you are not a child of God, you've never put on Christ in baptism, you can leave this auditorium, this building tonight, rejoicing in newfound hope and purpose by doing just what this eunuch did. By believing in Jesus Christ, believing in what He has done for you, the facts of the gospel, that He died for your sins, by confessing Him as Lord, repenting and being immersed in water so that you can rise in a newness of life. Will you do that tonight? Will you take advantage of the opportunity that you have right now to make sure that you can look forward to the end with confidence? Jesus is coming soon. As the song says, morning or night or noon, many will meet their doom. Which group will we be in? The power is yours tonight as to how you will respond to the greatest news that this world has ever known. If you're here tonight and you need to render obedience to Jesus Christ, we invite you to do that. Come up to the front as we stand and sing this song that has been chosen.